I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. At Wednesday's Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing, Senator Rand Paul questioned witnesses about the efficacy of sanctions. Speaking to Robert Malley, special envoy for Iran, Paul said that, quote, no behavior has changed despite punishing sanctions. The Kentucky senator asked Malley point blank whether sanctions have changed the behavior of Iran. Let's watch the exchange.
Thank you. Senator Paul.
I think a lot of the debate begins from a fundamental misconception of what sanctions can do and can't do. There seems to be an acknowledgement now that the maximum pressure campaign sanctions didn't change Iran's behavior. But I would go probably one step further and say that it's difficult to delineate what of Iran's behaviors have changed with any sanctions over a long period of time. Now, you can argue that they came to the table when there were universal sanctions with Europe and others, that had brought them to the table. But really also what brought them to the table was the carrot. The sanctions are a stick, but there was a carrot, and the carrot is the negotiation of releasing the sanctions. So some still have this misconception that we could forbid them through sanctions from selling their oil to China or Russia. Well, you could have a military embargo. You could have ships all up and down their coast, and they'd still sell their oil and gas across pipelines and across land to both Russia and China. Even a military embargo would not prevent them from this, and sanctions aren't going to prevent them from this. We need to quit looking at sanctions as the way to change behavior, because sanctions, frankly, don't change behavior. Sanctions are useful as a threat. If you're going to threaten somebody and say, if you do this, we'll do this, they might be a threat to deter behavior. Or if they're already doing something you don't want, you would ask them to quit doing that in exchange for removing the sanctions. But that means negotiations. But there are some members of the Senate who say they absolutely know in their mind that Iran's going to get a nuclear weapon. So they're essentially saying there are no negotiations and that sanctions are just for punishment. I think sanctions as punishment do have some effect. They punish, but they don't change the behavior. The punishment has been extraordinary, the maximum pressure sanctions, and no behavior has changed. So I guess my question to you is, do you think sanctions do change behavior? Do you see evidence that they have changed Iran's behavior, not maximum pressure, but sanctions in general?
Senator, thank you for that important question. I think we have seen the effective use of sanctions that led to the nuclear deal. They were sanctions, nuclear-related sanctions that were imposed in order to change Iran's nuclear behavior. We lifted those sanctions in exchange for the constraints and the inspection regime that Iran agreed to.
But the change in behavior is when we came to an agreement to release some of the sanctions and to have some relief in their trade account.
Absolutely. And the problem that we've seen is that the sanctions during the maximum pressure campaign, the sanctions were unmoored from any realistic diplomatic objective, and therefore they failed.
So I guess my specific question is, it seems to be the main sticking block is the IRGC being designated as a foreign trade terrorist organization. Would you characterize that as the main sticking point right now?
Well, I think that sticking point has in some ways been resolved in the sense that we made clear to Iran that if they wanted any concession on something that was unrelated to the JCPOA, like the FTO designation, we needed something reciprocal from them that would address our concerns.
Okay, so you would say it is one of the main, if not the main sticking point?
Well, I think I think Iran has made the decision that it's not prepared to take the reciprocal steps. They have to decide now: are they prepared to reach a deal without extraneous demands?
So I guess that gets to my next question: that there have been offers on our side to say, if you do this, we might be able to do this. Are those publicly? Are we publicly aware of what we have asked Iran to do that would be sufficient for removing the label?
No, we have not negotiated in public. We can have this discussion in a classified setting, but again, Iran has rejected any reasonable proposal at this point, as you've heard.
But I think it's important that if we do want negotiations, and the only way we're going to get any behavioral change is through negotiations by actually lessening sanctions is the only way you get it, unless you're adamant that they will not change behavior. If you want them to change behavior, we have to lessen. So even things such as labeling them as a foreign terrorist organization have to be negotiated. If we refuse to negotiate, they will, I think, ultimately get a nuclear weapon. So if we want that to happen, I think we have to be open to it. As far as advice on that front, I think it should be very specific, something they can actually demonstrate and do, whether that means something to do with funding of Hezbollah or activities of Hezbollah or activities of their proxies in other nations. But I don't know if that has to necessarily be a secret. I think that could be a public debate over this. And I think there's so much fear of removing the label of what you will have, political fallout from that, from both sides, frankly, that I don't know that. I think that's probably more difficult to overcome is the political outbreak here at home than anything else. But I think people should realize that even if we got rid of the foreign terrorist organization label, the IRGC's been under, as someone mentioned previously, they've been under sanctions at least since 2007 for funding Hezbollah in Lebanon. So there still would be sanctions. But we have to at least think this through, that the only way you get anywhere is you have to give something they want and they give something we want. That's what negotiations or diplomacy is. Sanctions otherwise are of absolutely no value. And so really, it gets back to the general question. Most of it's mischaracterizing what sanctions can do. Sanctions can punish, and they are punishing, but they aren't necessarily bringing them to the table. Getting rid of the sanctions might, or using sanctions as a threat. But I think the way that we've approached it as if, we're going to stop them from selling oil to more severe sanctions, I think that misses the boat of actually what sanctions could be used for in a negotiation. And from at least one senator, I would say that there has to be some behavioral change that they could do. And it can't be an ask that is impossible. There has to be some ask, but I see no reason why that ask can't be a public ask. But that's my advice. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Kay.
Thank you.